Throughout this Advent video series, I've mentioned tradition a few times. Sometimes we have no idea where things come from or why we do things, but just know somewhere in the past the way we do things started and we kind of like it. So call it a tradition, perhaps so we can keep doing it. The trouble with traditions is that we often can't remember what came before it. It must have been awful before we started having boiled eggs for breakfast on Christmas morning. I wonder what we ate. Having a background in electronics, I took an interest in a news item this week. The transistor is 75 years old. Now, when I first started training in electronics, valves, or tubes my American friends call them, were still taught and very much in use. These days, those hold all sorts of mystery and intrigue to most electronic engineers. A transistor is an amazing device. It can act as traffic lights in a busy electrical circuit, controlling the flow of electricity, or can work a bit like a cattle prod, where a little signal in one place becomes a jolt somewhere else. They really are very ordinary looking things and come in a variety of shapes and sizes. Here's a couple of examples I'm going to use in a project over the holidays. Nothing special at all. They really just cost a few pennies. But 75 years ago, these were an amazing invention. But here's the thing. What they do is very simple, and how they're made is even simpler. You can make them from a couple of grains of sand if you needed to, but the basic components are silicon and germanium. We really do take them for granted, despite transistors being the most manufactured device in all of history. A new word comes into existence around that time too. Unlike copper, which is a conductor, or rubber, which is not, a transistor sometimes is and sometimes isn't, depending on how you're using it. It became known as a semiconductor. I'll bet you've heard that word before. The weird thing with the invention of the transistor is that the theory was known long before the first one was ever made. There was already a system in place with glass valves or tubes that did more or less the same job. Tubes were just cumbersome and very hard to get right and use huge amounts of electricity compared with the humble transistor. Once the transistor came along, you didn't have to think about it anymore. You just knew it would be there and knew it would do what it was supposed to do. Several scientists figured out the theoretical, and it would be simple as soon as they could find the right materials to put it together and show what they already knew would work actually did. You may see where I'm going with this. Before Jesus came into the world, the arrival had been predicted and spelled out by Isaiah. For a child is born to us, a son is given to us. The government will rest on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Knowing what we know now, it's hard to read Isaiah in the context of it being written centuries before Christ was born. From the time Isaiah's words were recorded, speculation and impatience had been doled out in roughly equal measure by anyone who'd ever visited the temple, read a book, or listened to local leaders. By the time Jesus actually arrived, everybody seemed to be expecting him. That's why when John the Baptist had to specifically tell people, no, I'm not the one, He even used the words of Isaiah to make that clear. I am a voice shouting in the wilderness, clear the way for the Lord's coming. The wise men too set out knowing that a new king was due to be born and that he would be significant. They just didn't expect to find him where they did. They headed to the palace rather than the carpenter shop, you might remember. Likening Jesus to a transistor, something I never thought I'd be doing. But once Jesus arrived, a lot of things got a whole lot simpler. Instead of complicated rituals and rules, limited access, and always wondering if you'd done it right, the simplicity of the message that Christ and his life delivered changed everything. As simple as transistors are, and the very humble beginnings they had 75 years ago, you would have to say the world is a very different place today because of them. The scientists around at the birth of the first transistor could not possibly have imagined what that first step would do and where it would lead. What came into the world the first Christmas was the most expected, most predicted, and least understood event in all of history. The core message and simple command continues to radically change the world one person at a time. Love God and love people. Until tomorrow, goodbye.